Sydney Atheists are strong and proud members and supporters of the Secular Coalition of Australia. We're thrilled that in attendance today we have representatives from atheist, humanist, rationalist, skeptic, Secular Party of Australia and Christian groups from around Australia, including Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne, Canberra, Brisbane and Newcastle. I'd like to particularly thank our speakers today, Marion Maddox, Cathy Byrne, Lara Wood, Joe Kelly and Lynn Allison. As a coalition, we see that the only way to effect change in the political, media and social landscape is by combining our resources and uniting our voices. Ultimately, we'd like to arrest religious interference in education, life choices and culture in Australia. Of great interest to me, as I'm sure that it is to most everyone here, is that our first speaker, Marion Maddox, is a member of the Uniting Church congregation. Of course, Marion is also a secularist, something that many in the religious community share with Marion. The will of people like Marion brings into question the overtly religious policies of governments throughout Australia. This morning, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Marion, who will discuss secularism in Australia. Marion is Associate Professor at the Centre for Research on Social Inclusion at Macquarie University. She has doctorates in theology and political philosophy. She's written a number of books, including God Under Howard, The Rise of the Religious Right in Australian Politics, and her most recent one, which is on sale, in fact both of the books will be on sale a little bit later today, Taking God to School. Would you all give Marion a great welcome? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's really lovely to be here. And the story that I'm going to tell you today is a story of collaboration between people of many different religious views and none, going back well over a century to work out ways that people could all work together and produce an open, inclusive education for their children, because that was one of the driving questions that drove questions about what should be a fair and inclusive society in the Australian colonies from the 19th century onwards. So as long as there have been Europeans in Australia, that has been a moving issue, and so I hope you don't think that having a Christian here like me talking about secularism is incongruous. On the contrary, it is what has happened as long as there have been Europeans here, and I hope that the conversation that we're having today is not merely a continuation of a 19th century tradition, but something that we will be able to keep doing into the 21st century, because believe me, the kind of stories that we'll hear as the day progresses show that it's the kind of thing we badly need to do. Okay, when the Australian colonies were founded, of course there was very little in the way of government provision of anything, and education, along with other services, was provided in a very ad hoc basis, and was largely provided by religious organisations. So the first teachers in New South Wales were two convict women who had their salaries paid by the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. And the earliest schools were, in all the colonies, were mainly established by Christian churches, with here and there some provision for government funding. Tasmania and New South Wales were two places that put aside some proportion of taxes from an early period for public schooling. But public schooling was always erratic, always sparse, and only a small proportion of the colony's children actually had access to it. And the situation was universally agreed to be inadequate, because what happens when schooling is mainly provided by religious organisations, well, everybody needs their own. You need one for the Catholics, one for the Methodists, one for the Baptists, one for the, once there are enough of them, the Jews need theirs, and so on. And so it's very wasteful. You end up with duplication, and you have to pay to go. And so a lot of the colony's children were, much more than half of the colony's children by the middle of the 19th century were not getting access to schooling at all. So nobody thinks this is a good idea. Nobody thought it was a good idea in the 19th century. And the various colonies at different times held commissions of inquiry to decide what to do and to address the basic problem, and the basic problem everybody saw as unfairness, lack of equity, lack of access. So movements for secular education began, and by secular education, first of all, in the 19th century colonies, what people meant was ending public funding of religious schools, known as state aid. Movements for ending state aid began in the middle of the 19th century. The first colony to end state aid was Tasmania, which got rid of state aid in the 1850s. And other colonies followed: South Australia, Queensland and Victoria in the 1870s, and New South Wales and Western Australia in the 1880s. But ending public funding of religious schools is only one half of the story. Of course, you have to have something for everybody to go to if they're not going to a religious school. And so the other part of the story was the provision of public education. So the story through the 19th century was of ending state aid to denominational schools and of providing public education, and the catch cry for public education was that it needed to be free, compulsory and secular. Now, this is not because there was a tide of godlessness sweeping the colonies. The people who were campaigning for free, compulsory and secular education were not, by and large, atheists like most of you. They were mainly Christians like me. Why? Because there weren't very many atheists like you in 19th century Australia. There were a few, and some of them were active campaigners for free, compulsory and secular education. And this was a campaign which brought together people with very different religious worldviews. The few atheists and free thinkers that there were in the colonies in those days were active in those campaigns. But many of the people campaigning for free, compulsory and secular education were devout churchgoers, Jews who were on the boards of the synagogue, committed Catholics, committed Protestants of the many different denominations. And just by listing that diversity, you can maybe see why having a school system that didn't have religion as part of it mattered to those people. First of all, they decided they had, when you read the 19th century education debates, reading 19th century Hansard is an absolute hoot. They were so carried away by the sense that they were building a new nation, building a future that had to provide for the children of this new land that they were trying to build up. And so first of all, they decided that education had to be universal, and that meant it had to be compulsory. If it's compulsory, then you're saying certain things to parents. You're telling parents, you can't put your children to what seems like maybe the most rational thing to do, which is work. You're taking children out of lucrative employment, and so you have to take every possible barrier out of the way of what those children might most rationally otherwise be intending to do. First of all, you have to make education compulsory, and if you're making it compulsory, you can't go putting barriers in the way. You have to make it free. Now, the idea of free education was quite revolutionary in the 19th century, and it took a long time to to catch on. Tasmania didn't actually get rid of fees for public education until I think the 1890s. It was quite late. The fees were only like a penny a week, but still, if you're a poor family, a penny a week is a penny a week. So getting rid of fees was making education free was one step, but the other really big thing was getting rid of this problem, which was so well known in the 19th century colonies that it had its own name, that was just the shorthand by which everyone could refer to it in parliamentary debates, in the press and so on, and that shorthand was the religious difficulty. The religious difficulty was, what are we going to do about religious instruction in the schools? Protestants were not going to send their children to school if they thought that they were going to get subtle Catholic indoctrination. Catholics were not going to send their children to school if they thought that by sending them to the public school they were going to get subtle Protestant indoctrination. Jews and Unitarians were not going to send them to school if they were going to get subtly indoctrinated with the idea of the divinity of Christ. So nobody was going to send their children to school, in other words, if they were going to get taught something that was against the conscience of their families. And moreover, there was going to be no public support for something that was paid for out of taxpayers' funds if people were being taxed to pay for something, whether they had children or not, that was against their consciences. So there was a lot of debate in the parliaments about how can we demand money from the population to support a system that violates somebody's conscience. And so in the end, this idea that not only is education compulsory for children to go to, but it's compulsory for everybody as taxpayers to contribute to, kept stumbling up against this idea of the religious difficulty. And the 19th century legislators went over and over trying to think, you know, how can we get around this? Can we have some kind of generic religious instruction or religious education in our education system? Can we have some sort of religion that's so general that it doesn't offend anybody? And people would sort of try thinking about what sort of religion could be so general that it doesn't offend anybody. And of course, with the best will in the world, there is no kind of religion that's so general that it doesn't offend anybody, because it's always going to have some kind of content, unless you have a completely contentless religion. And there are these wonderful 19th century speeches saying, well, a contentless religion is ridiculous. And so eventually they decided that the only way that they could have an education system that was equitable, that was open to everybody, that was inclusive and welcoming, would be not to have religion in the schools at all. So it was not done because these people hated religion or thought it was destructive or evil. It was often done for reasons that were quite devout. One of my favourite speeches I found was from a Victorian, James Stephens, who said, I initially thought that we had to have some kind of religious instruction in the schools, but I've come to the conclusion that we have to get rid of it out of devotion, because no child ever has a positive, never has any fond memory of any religion taught to him in school. So he persuaded himself in favour of secular education by thinking that school religious instruction is such a turn-off. And anyone who's been following the SRI debate today would surely agree that he has a point. So the 19th century secular education debates are a story of people being able to overcome or work through their different points of view with the interest of children in the colonies in mind, and not only the interest of individual children, but also the interest of what kind of society they wanted to form. And if you read the debates today, the other thing that really strikes you is that they come across, whatever party they're from, they come across as a bunch of bleeding heart socialist social engineers. They really are mainly interested in what kind of society are we trying to build. They don't talk about education as a personal, individual benefit that will enable children to earn high salaries in the future and beat each other in the clawing to the top of the climb up the greasy pole. They don't talk about education as a something that will enable people to position themselves in some kind of international competition for scarce resources. They talk about education as something that benefits the entire society, and therefore that the entire society has an interest in constructing. And it's because of that, because of those commitments, that they saw creating a secular system as something that everybody should be committed to, whatever their personal religious or non-religious commitments. So that was what I learnt from reading the 19th century Hansard debates about the foundations of Australia's free, compulsory and secular public education system. That meant two things. It meant that public money couldn't be used to support denominational schools, because having denominational schools meant duplication. Fairness would require, as one of the speakers in the Queensland Parliament said, that we would have to, at public expense, have a school in every district for every religion that is practiced in the colony, and we can't afford that. And secondly, by doing that, that would divide students up, and dividing children on the basis of either wealth, ability to pay, or religion. He said, this is William Hemmant, Anglican member of the Queensland Parliament, teaches children to think themselves either better or worse than others, and that's not what you want when you're building a new society. So the solution was that in each of the colonies, funding to denominational schools was phased out over time. The schools that were owned by religious organisations were given a certain number of years to have the choice to be bought by the state, and they could choose not to, in which case they just had to keep running themselves at their own expense. But if they did choose to be bought by the state, then they were just incorporated into the public system, and a fully funded public school system was offered for all the children in the colony. So it had to be free, it had to be compulsory, and to overcome the religious difficulty, it had to be secular. Okay. Now, that was then the situation until 1964, when public funding for denominational schools, religious schools, was reinstated by Robert Menzies. And people here probably remember that better than I do. But Menzies first brought in funding for Catholic schools' science blocks in the ACT, which he could do because the ACT, not being a state, could be funded directly by the federal government. And that was a very small program, just £500 million, beg your pardon. Then that. So now we go to my first. So over the period since Menzies reintroduced funding for denominational schools, the actual amount of funding has increased on a rapidly going up. You can see, I'm really not a numbers kind of person. Pattern scale, but on a going down kind of scale, that's what's happened to the numbers of people identifying as Christian or as having any kind of religious adherence in Australia. So actually the very first incursions of federal funding into religious schools, began back before 1960s in 1954. And at that point, 89.4% of Australians identified as Christian, 0.6% as other, and 0.3% as nuns. Now, you probably all know the nuns figure is a little bit dicey because the way that they were counted in the census changed in the 1980s. So it's probably understated until 1986 when it was offered as an actual, 1976, sorry, when it was offered as an option in the census to identify that way. However, the most interesting number is the falling rate of people identifying as Christian. So we see sliding away identifying as Christian, but so from 89.4% in 1954 down to 61% in 2011. Pointing at the machine. I didn't even have to press, just did it magically. And similar pattern with people attending church monthly or more, 44% in 1950, down to 15% in 2013. But what has... See, I just have to look and it does it. But as the population has been getting less religious, public subsidies to religious organisations have been escalating. So I'll just give you another look. So Commonwealth funding to private schools. Before 1964, nothing. £5 million in 1964. So I translated all these into 2012 dollars. So equivalent of 125.1 million in 1964. That was Menzies science blocks. There were small allocations back into the 1950s, but the science blocks program in 1964 was when serious money of any kind started flowing into private schools. And up in still in 2012 dollars in 2012, $8.2 billion now going to private schools, and over 90% of private schools in Australia now are Christian. So there are small numbers of Muslim schools, Jewish schools, schools in the Montessori Waldorf Steiner tradition, around 100 of those, 125 I think I counted in 2012. And there are small numbers of private schools that specialise in particular things, like near me there's the McDonald School of the Performing Arts, and some non-religious private schools like the Sydney International School. But overwhelmingly in Australia, if you go to a private school, then it's likely to be some sort of Christian-based school. Okay, let's move on. And the percentage of students enrolled in private, broadly, mainly talking about Christian schools in Australia, has gone up. You can see from the 1960s, when federal funding of private schools began, only less than a quarter of students were enrolled in private schools, and that actually fell. The proportion enrolled in public schools peaked in 1977. You might wonder why the proportion of students enrolled in public schools peaked so late. 1977 was the high point since Federation for enrolment in public schools. The reason for that is because there were actually not universal pathways into tertiary education until the 1950s. So my grandparents both left school at 12, and there just weren't schools that you could go to finish school if you wanted to, and so the spread of comprehensive schools that went right through to year 12 came surprisingly late, and so that's the reason that for people in not my parents' generation but the generation before, if you wanted to finish school and go to university, you quite likely, unless you got selected for a selective high school, you quite likely went to a private school. So public school attendance peaked in 1977, has been falling ever since, just as religious adherence has also been falling. So people have been going to religious schools as their families have been getting less religious, but we've been pouring more and more money into religious schools as fewer of the population have been identifying with the religious traditions whose schools we've been funding. So exactly the situation that the 19th century founders of the public education system worried about, where the public is being taxed to support education systems that potentially don't agree with the consciences of the people who are paying for them, has come about. And another thing that the 19th century founders worried about, where children are growing up with networks of friends who think like them, or who at least are being taught one particular worldview, I suggest also is coming about. Now, maybe that is the path we want to go down as a nation, but I don't remember us deciding that that's the path we want to go down as a nation. We have, for the last 40 years or so, begun careering in exactly the opposite direction from the direction that the founders of our free, compulsory and secular education system carefully and methodically worked out was the fairest and most inclusive direction for an education system to be built on. And so I wrote my book saying I think it's time for us to stop and have a think, and if we do want to go in this direction, let's be able to articulate why it's a good idea for children to be divided, as William Hemmant warned, into groups divided by wealth, class and religion, not just slip that way without noticing. If we do want to tax the population to pay for particular religious views that most people don't share, then let's decide that rather than just do it by default. I was surprised to read in Slate magazine headlines saying that, and this was a sort of a shock horror headline, announcing with alarm that American government money was paying $11 million a year to schools that teach creationism either instead of or alongside the science curriculum. $11 million in America. We have less than a tenth of their population. How much do you think that we spend on subsidising schools that defend their right to teach creationism either instead of or alongside the science curriculum? $800 million a year. Did we decide that we wanted that was a wise investment of our public resources? I don't recall us deciding that. How did that come about? Well, because of another change that has happened over this period, which is that just in the late 1990s, a change occurred in not just the amount of funding going to public schools, but also the character of the schools that are funded, which is the rapid growth of a new sector in the public school. I keep saying it's very hard not to say private when you mean public and the other way around. A new sector in the private school market, which is a group of schools who refer to themselves as Christian schools, which is very confusing because over 90% of the private schools in Australia are Christian in one way or another. But these are a group of schools who come under umbrella groups: Christian Schools Australia, Australian Association of Christian Schools, Lutheran Schools Australia, and some, but not all, of the newer Anglican schools. And they distinguish themselves from the older, more establishment private schools by the fact that they infuse their theology through every part of the curriculum. So where a more traditional private school has maybe a religion or divinity lesson once a week and chapel once a week and chapel service, special service once a term, something like that. These schools that refer to themselves as Christian schools make a special effort to infuse every aspect of the curriculum with, they call it Christ-centred or Bible-based or some term like that. And these schools tend to be lower fees, so annual fees under $10,000 a year in the senior levels, and they're the ones that their umbrella organisations defend their right to teach creationism as part of the curriculum, and also that require their teachers to sign lifestyle agreements saying that they won't live in homosexual relationships and won't get pregnant out of wedlock or live with someone they're not married to, and so teachers can be sacked for doing any of those things, and in fact are sacked for doing those things, and they enjoy exemptions from anti-discrimination law so that they can do that. And students can be expelled or not enrolled in the first place if the student identifies as same-sex attracted, and also they, not all of them do, but they can impose religious affiliation requirements on families. So they can require family to sign a statement of faith, so you can't enrol if you are, well, we'll take the example of the one where Tony Abbott and Christopher Pyne launched their education policy, which is Penrith Christian School, that made headlines for having a statement of faith saying homosexuality is an abomination unto God. They've taken that part of it down off the website now, but it still says that you can't enrol if you're a Hindu, a Jew, a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Mormon, a Jehovah's Witness. And how much are taxpayers subsidising Penrith Christian School for people who don't want their children to meet a Mormon? $8,000 per student per year. Maybe we do want to provide a special little enclave at taxpayers' expense for people who don't want their children to meet a Mormon, but I don't recall us deciding as a community that that's a wise use of taxpayers' resources. So the existence of the low-fee independent Christian schools, as they're known, is another sort of dimension of the intensification of religiosity in the education market that has come along with the falling away of religious adherence in the community overall, and something that has passed generally unnoticed. What's up next? Then the, as well as funding of religious schools, is the infusion of public money into the public school system. So the National School Chaplaincy Program is the most startling example of this, but there are also other examples which I think we'll get on to talking about in the next section. So the National School Chaplaincy Program, I imagine you're fairly familiar with, but schools can apply for grants of up to $20,000 per school per year to have a chaplain who gives pastoral care, religious and personal advice to students and staff, regardless of their religious beliefs, but the catch is that the chaplains are largely provided by evangelical Christian organisations. Now, the scheme was adjusted in 2012 by the Federal Labor government so that schools have the option to employ a secular welfare worker instead of a religious chaplain. But Christopher Pyne has said that his preference is for it to go back to being a strictly religious program. So he hasn't actually taken any steps to make that happen, but that's what he said the current government's position is. The majority of federally funded chaplains, although it's open to private schools to apply for the money, over 70% of them actually operate in public schools, and over 90% are are Christian, and of those, over 95% are evangelical Protestants, although those figures are from before the adjustment to allow for the secular welfare worker option. They're forbidden to proselytise, but of course there's no definition of what proselytising is. And so there was this wonderful exchange in Senate estimates where Senator Brett Mason from Queensland asked representatives from the Education Department, if a chaplain says to a child, God loves you, would that be proselytising? And the Education Department officials were, they went on debating it back and forth for pages and pages of the committee Hansard about actually, well, would that be proselytising or not? And the department's response was basically, well, Senator Mason, you know what proselytising is. These things have been well worked through. And he kept saying, well, I think I know, but how can you tell? And there is no definition of what proselytising is, so how can you tell? They kept saying, well, it would depend on the context. Well, it would depend on the context. Well, of course it would depend on the context, but what is it about the context that makes it undue pressure if a chaplain says to a child, God loves you? It's hard to think of a context where an adult talking to a child wouldn't be seen as pressurising to say something like that. Now this is the bit where I get to peer sternly at you over my glasses and point out that in the history of religious incursions into the public sphere, not only this, I've been telling a story about schools. I have more information about outsourcing of welfare services, but I think I'll stop and hand over to my colleague Kathy, who's just arrived. But just before I do, this is the take-home message for this part, that all the expansions of religious activity in the public sphere that I've talked about so far have been overseen by politicians or bureaucrats, but mainly politicians, who either identified as atheists or as not particularly religious. So, biggest expansion of the National School Chaplaincy Program, who did that? Julia Gillard, more than doubled it, spread it into, she said she wanted it to go into another 1,000 public schools, and she did. Who introduced the National School Chaplaincy Program? John Howard. Was John Howard a very religious person? Well, if you read his memoirs now, he was. But at the time that he was in office, Geraldine Doog asked him, was religion a big part of your life? He said, no, it's a small part of my life. Is it in the foreground of your thinking? She asked. No, he said, it's in the background. Is it central to the way that you bring up your children? No, he said, it's in the background of the way I bring up my children. Robert Menzies, when Professor John Warhurst, my colleague from ANU, did a classification of the religiosity of Australia's Prime Ministers, Robert Menzies, who first introduced federal funding to religious schools, he classified Menzies as nominally religious, and who fought the good fight to allow the Labor Party to finally allow state aid to religious schools. Gough Whitlam, who described himself as not, the best he could manage for electoral purposes was a fellow traveller with Christianity, but when he won the Divinity Prize at school, the principal said, "I'm not giving it to you because you don't really believe any of this," and he was, John Warhurst classifies him as one of Australia's atheist prime ministers. So the incursions of religion into Australia's public sphere are what happen when we take our eye off the religious ball. What happen when people use religion cynically because they think it doesn't matter. I'm here to tell you religion matters. You might not believe it, but you've got to take it seriously. Don't take your eye off the ball. You've got to think about it and care about it in whatever way you can. Now I'm going to hand over to Cathy Byrne, who was one of my star PhD students and now is forging a career as an expert on religion and education. And she's going to talk for a while and then we'll take questions together.